My parents, who paid for my college education, refused to pay, but happily financed my spoiled brother's trinkets for years. I finally exposed their lies in front of everyone at a family wedding. Growing up, I always knew that my younger brother Nick was the golden child. My parents adored him, showering him with affection and praise for even the smallest of accomplishments. Meanwhile, I was expected to excel without much fanfare. "You're the responsible one," they would say. "Nick needs more encouragement." It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I learned to live with it. After all, family dynamics are rarely fair, but the favoritism became glaringly obvious when it was time for me to go to college. I'd worked hard in high school, earning good grades and getting into a reputable university. I was excited about the future, but there was one major hurdle: money. My parents had always promised to help with college expenses, and I counted on their support to make it through school without drowning in debt. When I sat down with them to discuss tuition, the conversation took a turn I hadn't anticipated. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, while my mother nervously fidgeted with the papers in front of her. "We're really proud of you," my dad began, "but we're not in a position to help you financially right now." I stared at them in disbelief. "What do you mean? You've always said you'd help with college." My mum avoided my eyes, focusing intently on the stack of bills in front of her. "Things have changed," she said softly. "Your father's business isn't doing as well as it used to, and we have other expenses to think about." I didn't understand. I had seen them splurge on a new car for themselves just a few months earlier. They took regular vacations, bought expensive gadgets, and never seemed to worry about money. How could they not afford to help with something as important as my education? "But you've always said education is a priority," I pressed, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Can't you at least help with part of it?" "We just can't," my father said, his tone final. "You're smart. You can figure it out." It was like a punch to the gut. I had been counting on their support, and now, with no warning, they were pulling the rug out from under me. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, holding back tears as I left the room. I spent the next few weeks scrambling to figure out how to pay for college. I applied for every scholarship I could find, took out student loans, and picked up extra hours at my part-time job. It was stressful, and there were nights when I wondered if it was even worth it. But I was determined to make it work. I wasn't going to let this setback stop me from pursuing my dreams. Over the next few years, I juggled my coursework with multiple jobs, often sacrificing sleep and social activities to keep my head above water. My friends would talk about going on vacations during school breaks, but I couldn't afford to take time off. My days were filled with lectures, study sessions, and shifts at the campus coffee shop or the library. It was exhausting, but I kept pushing forward, driven by the knowledge that I was doing this on my own. Despite the challenges, I managed to graduate with honours. Walking across that stage to receive my diploma was one of the proudest moments of my life. I had done it. I had earned my degree without any help from my parents. But even as I celebrated that achievement, a part of me couldn't shake the lingering resentment. I had done everything right, played by the rules, and yet I had been left to fend for myself. Meanwhile, Nick, who was 4 years younger, seemed to float through life without a care in the world. He wasn't particularly ambitious or hardworking, but my parents doted on him like he was the second coming of Einstein. When Nick graduated from high school, I thought maybe he would have to face some of the same struggles I did. Maybe my parents would finally realize how unfair they had been to me. But no, when it came time for Nick to decide what he wanted to do with his life, my parents were ready and willing to finance whatever path he chose. He didn't want to go to college, so they bought him a new car and set him up with a business that was little more than an expensive hobby. He tried his hand at different things: photography, real estate, even a short-lived stint as a YouTuber, but nothing stuck. And through it all, my parents kept funding his whims, never once suggesting that he might have to figure things out on his own like I had. It was infuriating to watch. I had struggled and sacrificed to make something of myself, while Nick lived a life of luxury without any consequences. But I bit my tongue and tried to focus on my own life. I had built a successful career, paid off my student loans, and was doing well for myself. I didn't need my parents' money, and I told myself I didn't care about the favoritism anymore. But deep down, the resentment festered. Every time I saw my parents bragging about Nick's latest venture, or heard them making excuses for his lack of direction, it was like a slap in the face. And what hurt the most was that they didn't seem to see anything wrong with it. They didn't see how their actions had driven a wedge between us, how their blatant favoritism had made me feel like an outsider in my own family. The final straw came when Nick announced that he wanted to buy a luxury sports car. He had seen one at a car show and decided that it was exactly what he needed to complete his image as a successful entrepreneur. I assumed my parents would finally put their foot down, tell him that he needed to earn the money himself if he wanted such an extravagant purchase. But no, they were all too happy to dip into their savings to make Nick's dream a reality. When I found out, I felt like I was going to explode. This was beyond anything I could tolerate. My parents had claimed they couldn't afford to help me with college, but they had no problem dropping a small fortune on a sports car for my brother. It was the ultimate betrayal, and I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I confronted my parents about it, demanding to know how they could justify spending so much money on Nick's whims when they had refused to help me with something as important as my education. But instead of acknowledging the unfairness, they brushed me off, accusing me of being jealous and ungrateful. My father even had the audacity to suggest that I should be proud of how they were supporting Nick's entrepreneurial spirit. That was the moment I knew I had to take a stand. I had spent too long biting my tongue, trying to keep the peace for the sake of family harmony. But this time, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I decided that the next time we were all together as a family, I would expose their lies in front of everyone. If they wanted to play favourites, they were going to have to own up to it publicly. And as it happened, there was a perfect opportunity coming up, a family wedding. My cousin Sarah was getting married, and the entire extended family would be there. It was the kind of event where my parents would be putting on their best faces, playing the part of the generous, supportive parents who had always done right by their children. Little did they know, I was about to shatter that illusion. I knew it was going to be messy. There would be fallout, and I wasn't sure how the rest of the family would react, but at that point I didn't care. I was done playing nice, done pretending that everything was okay. It was time for the truth to come out. The week leading up to my cousin Sarah's wedding was filled with the usual flurry of activity. Last-minute dress fittings, confirming travel plans, and trying to decide on the perfect gift. But while everyone else in the family was focused on celebrating, I had something else on my mind. I was preparing for what I knew would be a confrontation that could change everything. I had always been the quiet, responsible one, the one who never caused trouble or made a scene. But the years of biting my tongue, of swallowing my pride while my parents showered Nick with everything he wanted, had taken their toll. I wasn't going to let this continue. They needed to be held accountable, and the wedding seemed like the perfect opportunity to expose the truth. The wedding day arrived, and the weather was perfect, sunny, warm, and just right for an outdoor ceremony. The venue was a beautiful estate with sprawling gardens, and everything was decorated in white and gold, with flowers everywhere. It was the kind of picture-perfect day you'd expect for a family gathering, with everyone dressed to the nines and smiling for the cameras. But underneath it all, I was seething. Nick arrived at the wedding with our parents, looking every bit the spoiled golden boy he'd always been. He was wearing a tailored suit, flashing his latest expensive watch and showing off the keys to his new sports car. I watched from a distance as my parents proudly introduced him to relatives, talking about how well he was doing and how they were so proud of him. They conveniently left out the part where they had financed his entire lifestyle, while I had been left to fend for myself. As the ceremony began, I tried to focus on Sarah and her big day. She looked stunning in her wedding dress, and I could see the love and joy on her face as she exchanged vows with her new husband. For a moment, I almost reconsidered my plan. I didn't want to ruin her special day. But then I saw my parents again, sitting in the front row, beaming with pride as Nick charmed the guests around him. The anger bubbled up inside me once more, and I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. After the ceremony, we moved to the reception area, where tables were set up under a large white tent. The atmosphere was festive, with music playing, waiters circulating with trays of champagne, and everyone mingling and congratulating the newlyweds. I kept my distance from my parents and Nick, watching as they continued to bask in the admiration of the other guests. As the evening wore on, the time for speeches arrived. The best man and maid of honour gave their toasts, sharing funny and heartfelt stories about the bride and groom. The crowd laughed, clapped, and raised their glasses in celebration. Then the microphone was passed around to other family members who wanted to say a few words. I saw my parents whispering to each other, my father gesturing toward the microphone. I knew what was coming. They were going to take this opportunity to brag about how proud they were of both their children, how they had raised us to be successful and independent. I could practically hear the lies forming on their lips. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest as I stood up from my seat. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. Before my parents could make their way to the microphone, I stepped forward and took it myself. The room went quiet as everyone turned to look at me, their faces curious and expectant. My parents froze in place, their smiles faltering as they realized what was happening. "I'd like to say a few words," I began, my voice steady but firm. I could see the confusion on my parents' faces, but I ignored it. I was done worrying about their feelings. "I want to start by saying how happy I am for Sarah and Mark," I continued, nodding toward the newlyweds, who were watching me with kind, supportive smiles. "You two are perfect for each other, and I wish you all the happiness in the world." There was a murmur of approval from the crowd, and I could see some of my relatives nodding and smiling. I knew they didn't see what was coming, but I also knew that this was the only way to get the truth out. "But there's something I've been holding on to for a long time," I said, my voice growing stronger, "and I think it's time I finally speak up." I glanced over at my parents, who were now looking distinctly uncomfortable. My mother was fidgeting with the edge of her shawl, while my father's expression had hardened. Nick was staring at me with a look of mild curiosity, clearly unaware of what was about to happen. "For years," I continued, "I've watched as my parents have showered my brother Nick with everything he could ever want. They bought him cars, financed his hobbies, and supported him in every way possible. Meanwhile, when I asked for help with something as important as my college education, they told me they couldn't afford it." A ripple of shock went through the room. I could see people exchanging surprised glances, some of them whispering to each other. My parents' faces had gone pale, and I could see the panic in their eyes as they realized I was exposing their favoritism in front of everyone. I had to work multiple jobs, take out loans, and struggle through college on my own, I said, the words coming out faster now as the floodgates opened. I did it, and I'm proud of what I accomplished, but it wasn't easy. And all the while I watched as my parents continued to pour money into Nick's life, financing every whim and luxury he wanted. I turned to face my parents directly, my voice filled with the years of hurt and anger I had kept bottled up. "You told me there wasn't enough money for my education, but you had no problem buying Nick a sports car. You've made excuses for him at every turn, while I had to fend for myself, and you expect me to stay silent? To just accept it? No more." The room was dead silent now, all eyes on me. I could see the stunned expressions on the faces of my relatives, who had always believed the image my parents had carefully crafted over the years. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. My father finally found his voice, but it was shaky and uncertain. "That's enough," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "This isn't the time or place for this." "Oh, I think it is," I shot back, my anger flaring. "You've had years to address this, to make things right, but you never did. You never even acknowledged how unfair you've been. Well, now everyone knows. I'm done pretending everything is fine." Nick, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke up, his tone defensive. "It's not my fault they helped me out," he said, sounding more like a petulant child than the successful entrepreneur he liked to present himself as. "You're just jealous because you couldn't hack it on your own." I turned to him, my eyes narrowed. "Jealous? Of what exactly? I've built a life for myself without needing to be spoon-fed by our parents. I've earned everything I have. Can you say the same? Nick opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked flustered, caught off guard by my directness. For once, he didn't have a quick comeback or a clever retort. My mother, who had been quietly crying, finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "We never meant to hurt you," she said, her eyes pleading. "We just wanted to help Nick because we thought he needed it more. You were always so strong, so capable. We thought you could handle it." "And I did," I replied, my voice softening slightly. "But that doesn't excuse the way you treated me. You made me feel like I didn't matter, like I wasn't worth the same effort and support that you gave to Nick, and I'm tired of pretending that it didn't hurt." The room was still silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. I could see the gears turning in the minds of my relatives as they processed what I had said. Some of them looked uncomfortable, others sympathetic, but no one said anything. It was clear that the image of the perfect, supportive family my parents had worked so hard to maintain was beginning to crumble. "I'm not saying this to embarrass you," I continued, addressing my parents directly. "I'm saying it because it's the truth. And the truth is, you've hurt me in ways you can't even imagine. You favoured Nick at my expense, and it's time you acknowledged that." My father looked like he wanted to say something, but for once he was at a loss for words. My mother's tears flowed freely now, and I could see the guilt and regret in her eyes. Nick, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to be anywhere but there, his confident facade completely shattered. Taking a deep breath, I stepped back from the microphone, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to them to deal with the fallout. "I'm done being silent," I said, my voice quieter but no less firm. "I deserve better than that, and if you can't see that, then maybe it's time I start focusing on the people who do." With that, I set the microphone down and walked away, the tension in the room palpable as I made my way toward the exit. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt like I had finally taken control of my own narrative. I had spoken my truth, and there was no going back. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The anger, the bitterness, the resentment, it was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I had taken the first step toward healing, toward reclaiming my life from the shadow of my parents' favoritism. The wedding was still going on behind me, but I knew I couldn't go back in. Not yet. I needed time to process what had just happened, to figure out where I stood with my family now that the truth was out. I walked to my car, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. There would be fallout, I knew that. My parents would likely be furious, and Nick would no doubt play the victim, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I had spent too long worrying about their feelings, their perceptions, and it was time to put myself first. As I drove away from the venue, I felt a sense of liberation I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I had finally broken free from the chains of my parents' favoritism, and that, more than anything, was worth whatever came next. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts racing faster than the car. I couldn't stop replaying the scene at the wedding, the shocked faces of my relatives, my parents' stunned silence, and the raw emotion that had poured out of me. I'd imagined confronting them for so long, but I had never truly believed I would do it, let alone in front of the entire family. But now that it was done, a strange calm had settled over me, like the eye of a storm. I had said what I needed to say, and there was no taking it back. The truth was out, and there was no more pretending. Yet, as I pulled into my driveway, that calm began to waver. I knew the fallout from this would be messy, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. As I entered my house, the silence felt heavier than usual. I had lived on my own for a few years now, having moved out as soon as I could afford it after college. The space, usually my sanctuary, felt strangely isolating tonight. I sank onto the couch, staring at my phone, waiting for the inevitable barrage of calls and messages. It didn't take long. The first call came from my mother. I watched the phone buzz on the coffee table, her name flashing on the screen. I couldn't bring myself to answer. What could she possibly say that would make a difference? Apologies would feel hollow, and excuses would only make things worse, so I let it ring. When the buzzing finally stopped, I saw that she had left a voicemail. I didn't listen to it. The next call was from my father. This time, I almost picked up. Almost. But the thought of hearing his voice, likely filled with anger and disappointment, made my stomach turn. I let that one go to voicemail too. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text message. It was from Nick. I hesitated, then opened it. Nick, what the hell was that? You humiliated us in front of everyone. I don't know what your problem is, but you need to get over it. Mum and Dad did their best, and you just embarrassed them like that? You've always been jealous of me. Grow up. I stared at the screen, feeling a surge of anger and disbelief. Even now, after everything, Nick couldn't see past his own self-interest. He didn't understand, or maybe he didn't want to. To him, I was just the bitter sibling, the one who couldn't handle the fact that he had it easier. But it was more than that, so much more. It was the years of neglect, the blatant favoritism, the way I had been made to feel like I didn't matter. I didn't respond. What was the point? Nick had always been oblivious to anything that didn't revolve around him, and I wasn't about to waste my energy trying to make him understand. Instead, I tossed my phone onto the couch and leaned back, closing my eyes and trying to steady my thoughts. But the peace I'd felt after leaving the wedding was slipping away, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. What had I done? Had I really just blown up my relationship with my parents in front of the entire family? And for what? To finally get them to see the pain they had caused. Would it even make a difference? The doubts crept in, whispering that maybe I had made a mistake, that maybe I should have handled things differently. But I pushed them aside. No. I'd been silent for too long, allowing my parents to rewrite history, to present themselves as the perfect family. It was time for the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I tried to distract myself with a movie, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the wedding, to the confrontation, and to the fallout that was sure to come. When I finally went to bed, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, the weight of what I had done pressing down on me. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling exhausted and on edge. My phone was already buzzing with more messages, some from family members who had been at the wedding, others from relatives who had heard about the incident through the grapevine. I knew I couldn't avoid it forever, so I started going through them. The messages were a mixed bag. Some were supportive, expressing sympathy and understanding. My cousin Sarah, the bride, had texted to say she was sorry I had gone through that and that she was here for me if I needed to talk. Another cousin, one I wasn't particularly close to, had sent a message saying she admired my courage and had always suspected something was off with how my parents treated me and Nick. But there were also messages that were less kind. An aunt on my mother's side had sent a long message chastising me for causing a scene at the wedding, telling me I should have kept family matters private. An uncle from my dad's side had sent a similar message accusing me of being ungrateful and disrespectful. I deleted those without responding. There was still no response from my parents. No texts, no emails, nothing. Just the 2 voicemails I hadn't listened to. I wondered what they were thinking, how they were processing everything. Were they angry, hurt, or were they finally realizing how deeply they had hurt me? As the morning dragged on, I felt the weight of isolation more acutely. I had taken a stand, but now I was left alone to deal with the consequences. I didn't regret what I had done, but I wasn't prepared for how lonely it would feel. I spent the day trying to distract myself with work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had fundamentally changed. The truth was out, and there was no going back. My relationship with my parents, already strained, had likely reached a breaking point. But even as I wrestled with the fallout, I knew I had done the right thing. I had spoken my truth, and that was something I couldn't take back. In the late afternoon, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity got the better of me, and I went to the door. When I opened it, I found myself face to face with my mother. She looked tired, her eyes red and puffy as if she had been crying. Her usual composed demeanour was gone, replaced by an expression of vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice shaky. I hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. She walked into the living room and sat down on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I could see she was struggling to find the right words, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "I listened to your voicemail last night," she said softly. "I've been thinking about what you said, and I realise that maybe we haven't been as fair to you as we should have been." "Maybe," I repeated, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. She winced but didn't deny it. "I know we made mistakes," she continued. "We thought we were doing what was best, but I see now that we hurt you. We didn't mean to, but that doesn't change the fact that we did." I crossed my arms, not ready to let her off the hook that easily. "Do you have any idea how hard it was for me to get through college without your help? How it felt to watch you spend money on Nick's every whim while I had to fend for myself?" Tears welled up in her eyes and she nodded. "I'm so sorry. I really am. We thought you were strong enough to handle it, and maybe we took that for granted. But that doesn't excuse what we did. You deserved our support, and we failed you." I didn't know how to respond. I had expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even denial. But here she was, admitting that they had been wrong, apologising in a way I had never heard before. It caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. "I appreciate you saying that," I finally replied, my voice softer than before. "But it's going to take more than an apology to fix this. There's been so much damage, so much hurt. I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were." She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I understand. And I don't expect you to forgive us right away, but I want to try to make things right. I want to be better, for you and for Nick." At the mention of Nick, my anger flared again. "Nick doesn't need your help, Mum. He's been given everything on a silver platter, and he still hasn't done anything with it. Maybe it's time he learns to stand on his own 2 feet." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with regret. "I know. We've enabled him, and that's on us, but he's still our son, and we want to help him find his way." I shook my head, feeling the familiar frustration bubbling up. "You've been trying to help him find his way for years, and look where it's gotten him. Maybe what he needs is a wake-up call, not more coddling." She sighed, nodding slowly. "You're right. We've been handling things the wrong way, but please, give us a chance to make it right. I don't want to lose you over this." The vulnerability in her voice, the raw emotion, was something I hadn't expected. It softened something inside me, but I wasn't ready to forgive just yet. "I need time," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "I need time to process all of this, to figure out where we go from here." She nodded, tears spilling over as she stood up. "I understand. Take all the time you need. Just know that we love you, and we want to make things better." As she walked to the door, she paused and turned back to me. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here. No pressure, no expectations. Just whenever you're ready." I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything more. She gave me a sad smile and left, closing the door softly behind her. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. My mother's visit had shaken me, not because of what she said, but because of how genuine she seemed. It wasn't the defensive, dismissive response I had expected. It was an admission of guilt, of regret, and that was something I hadn't been prepared for. The anger, the bitterness, they were still there, but they were no longer the driving force. My mother's words had planted a seed of doubt, a tiny crack in the wall I had built around my heart. Could things really change? Could my parents truly make amends after all these years? I didn't know the answer, and that uncertainty was unsettling. But as I sat down on the couch, I realised that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. One that didn't involve cutting my family out of my life entirely. But it would take time, patience, and a lot of healing, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for that just yet. The days following my mother's visit were marked by a strange quiet. The tension that had been so sharp and palpable was still there, but it had softened into something more complicated, less anger, more uncertainty. I had spent so many years steeling myself against my parents' favoritism, bracing for the inevitable slights and dismissals, that the possibility of reconciliation felt foreign, even unsettling. I didn't reach out to my parents right away. I needed time to process, to let my emotions settle. The memory of my mother's tears, her voice trembling with regret, played on a loop in my mind, mingling with years of unresolved resentment. I knew she was sincere in her apology, but I also knew that words alone weren't enough to undo the damage. It was going to take more than that. Real change, consistent effort, and a willingness to confront the past. A week later, I got another message from Nick. This one wasn't as defensive as the first, but it wasn't exactly conciliatory either. Nick, Mum said you two talked. She's been upset. You didn't have to go nuclear at the wedding. I get that you're mad, but couldn't we have handled this differently? I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide how to respond. Nick had never really understood the depth of my feelings, or the extent of the hurt I had carried all these years. He was used to being the favourite, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, and while he had benefited from that, I wasn't sure he fully grasped the toll it had taken on me. After a few minutes, I started typing. Me. Maybe we could have, but that wasn't my responsibility. I tried to talk to Mum and Dad before, but they never listened. I've spent years watching them prioritise you over me, and I'm done pretending it's okay. If they're upset, that's on them. This wasn't just about the wedding, Nick. It was about years of being treated like I didn't matter. I hit send, my heart pounding as I waited for his response. I wasn't sure if he would react with anger or defensiveness, or if he would finally start to understand. When his reply came, it was more measured than I expected. Nick, I never realised you felt that way. I always thought you were fine, that you didn't need the same kind of help I did. I guess I didn't think about how it looked from your side. I'm sorry. I blinked, surprised by the unexpected apology. It wasn't exactly what I had been hoping for, but it was something, a small step in the right direction. Me. I get that you didn't see it, but that doesn't change the fact that it hurt. I'm not trying to ruin our relationship, Nick. I just want things to be fair, to be honest. I've been carrying this alone for too long. Nick, I get that now. I'll talk to Mum and Dad. I don't know how to fix this, but I'll try. I don't want to lose you over this. I sighed, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. Nick's willingness to talk was a positive sign, but it was also clear that he didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation. This wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. It was going to take time, effort, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Me. Thanks. I appreciate that. Just understand that this isn't going to be easy. There's a lot to unpack, and it's going to take time. Nick. I get it. Let's just try to start fresh? I hesitated before responding. A fresh start sounded good in theory, but it wasn't something that could be granted with the snap of a finger. Still, it was a beginning, and maybe that was enough for now. Me. Yeah, let's try. I set my phone down, feeling a strange sense of closure. The confrontation at the wedding had been painful, but it had forced my family to confront the reality of our situation. It wasn't just about the favoritism, it was about the years of resentment, the lack of communication, and the unspoken hurts that had festered beneath the surface. The cracks in our family had been there all along. The wedding had simply brought them into the light. The next weekend, I got a call from my dad. This time I answered. Hey, he said, his voice gruff but with an edge of uncertainty that I wasn't used to hearing from him. I was wondering if we could talk. I hesitated, then nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Okay, I'm listening. There was a long pause, and I could almost picture him sitting at the kitchen table, struggling to find the right words. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he began, at the wedding and when we talked afterwards, and I realised maybe we haven't been as fair to you as we should have been. It wasn't a full admission of guilt, but it was close enough. I didn't push him for more, knowing how hard it must have been for him to say even that much. I just want you to know, he continued, that we're proud of you. We always have been. We might not have shown it the way we should have, but it's true. And I'm sorry if we made you feel like you weren't as important as Nick. That was never our intention. I swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in my throat. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means a lot to hear." Another pause then. "Your mum and I, we want to make things right. We know it won't be easy, but we're willing to try. We want to start over, if you'll let us." I closed my eyes, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. This was what I had wanted for so long, for my parents to acknowledge the hurt they had caused, to understand that their actions had real consequences, and now, finally, they were offering me that. "I want that too," I said, my voice steady. "But like I told Mum, it's going to take time. We can't just pretend the past didn't happen." "I know," he replied, his voice softer now. "We're ready to put in the work, whatever it takes." For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. My parents weren't perfect, and they had made mistakes, big ones. But maybe, just maybe, they were capable of change. Maybe we all were. "Okay," I said, feeling a sense of resolution. "Let's take it one step at a time." The conversation ended on a hopeful note, and when I hung up, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like we were all walking it together. The following weeks were filled with small, tentative steps toward healing. My parents reached out more often, not just to check in, but to genuinely engage with me, to ask about my life, my work, my feelings. It wasn't always comfortable. There were awkward moments, silences that stretched too long, but it was progress. Nick, true to his word, made an effort as well. He didn't shy away from difficult conversations, and we had a few heart-to-hearts about our childhood, our parents, and the impact of their favoritism. It wasn't easy, and there were times when the old resentment flared up, but we were both trying, and that made a difference. The biggest change, though, was in my relationship with my parents. They began to recognize and address the imbalance that had been there for so long. They stopped making excuses for Nick's behavior and started holding him accountable, encouraging him to take responsibility for his own life. And while it wasn't a complete reversal overnight, the fact that they were trying meant the world to me. One evening, a few months after the wedding, my parents invited me over for dinner. It was the first time I'd been to their house since the confrontation, and I was nervous as I walked up the driveway. But when my mother opened the door, her face lit up with a genuine smile, and my father greeted me with a warm hug, something he hadn't done in years. The tension that had once defined our relationship had been replaced by a sense of mutual respect and understanding. We sat down to dinner, the conversation flowing easily. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, still memories that stung, but it was a start. As we ate, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. We were rebuilding, slowly but surely, and that was enough for now. After dinner, we moved to the living room, where my mother brought out a photo album filled with pictures from my childhood. We flipped through the pages together, reminiscing about old memories, some happy, some bittersweet. There were photos of family vacations, birthday parties, and school events, all moments that had once felt overshadowed by the favoritism toward Nick. But now, looking at them through the lens of our recent reconciliation, they felt different, like pieces of a puzzle that were finally starting to fit together. As the evening drew to a close, my parents walked me to the door. My mother hugged me tightly, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. "We're so proud of you," she whispered. "You've always been strong, but we should have been there for you more. We're sorry, and we love you." "I love you too, Mom," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. My father clapped me on the shoulder, his expression serious but warm. "We've got a lot to make up for, but we're ready to do it. Thanks for giving us the chance." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep within me. "We've all got work to do," I said, "but I'm glad we're doing it together." As I drove home that night, I reflected on how far we had come. The confrontation at the wedding had been painful, but it had also been necessary. It had forced us all to face the truth, to confront the unspoken hurts that had festered for years, and while the road to healing was still long, we were walking it together, step by step. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, staring up at the night sky. I felt a sense of peace, of closure, that I hadn't felt in a long time. The wounds of the past were still there, but they were beginning to heal, and I knew that with time, they would fade into scars, reminders of where we had been, but no longer defining where we were going. I stepped out of the car and walked into my house, feeling lighter, freer. The journey to this point had been hard, but it had been worth it. I had found my voice, spoken my truth, and in doing so had opened the door to a new beginning. As I closed the door behind me, I knew that the future was still uncertain, still filled with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it, because I wasn't facing it alone. My family, flawed and imperfect as they were, was by my side, and that more than anything was enough.